In the modern world, the name Marvel is synonymous with a cultural juggernaut that dominates every corner of the entertainment industry. It is a brand currently valued at over $33 billion, a staggering figure that represents more than just ticket sales. It represents a global mythology and the most successful cinematic experiment in history. However, if you were to step back into a cold, grey courtroom in December of 1996, you would find a reality that stands in shocking contrast to the glory of today. In that room, there were no flashing lights, no red carpets, and certainly no heroes waiting to save the day. Instead, there were only weary lawyers, mountains of legal documents, and the suffocating silence of a dying empire. The company that had defined childhood for generations was officially filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The house that Spider-Man built was not just shaking, it was crumbling into the dust of corporate litigation and financial ruin. The collapse did not happen overnight. It was the result of a massive, speculative bubble that had been growing throughout the early 1990s. For years, the comic book industry had been experiencing an artificial boom. Collectors were buying multiple copies of every single issue, convinced that a comic book bought for $2 today would be worth thousands in the future. Marvel leaned into this frenzy with aggressive marketing, producing variant covers and limited edition prints designed to trigger the collector's impulse. It was a gold rush built entirely on paper. But as any historian of finance will tell you, every bubble eventually bursts. By 1993, the market reached its breaking point. People realized that if everyone owned 5 copies of the same comic, that comic was no longer rare or valuable. The market was oversaturated, and the excitement turned into a panic. Warehouses began to fill with millions of unsold books that were worth nothing more than pulp. Marvel's stock price, which had once soared toward the high heavens, began a terrifying descent, losing over 90% of its value in just a few short years. Faced with total annihilation and the very real threat of permanent liquidation, the leadership at Marvel had to make a series of choices that would haunt the company for decades. They needed cash to pay their staff and keep the lights on, and they needed it immediately. They began a desperate fire sale of their most valuable assets, what many insiders called the crown jewels of the company. Imagine a king selling his throne and his scepter just to pay for a single meal. That was the state of Marvel in the mid-90s. They approached Sony Pictures and offered them the movie rights to almost every character they owned for a relatively small sum. Sony, however, famously only wanted the web slinger. They bought the movie rights to Spider-Man for what now seems like a pittance, roughly $7 million. Shortly after, the rights to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four were handed over to 20th Century Fox. Marvel was effectively gutting its own history just to survive another week. They were trading their entire future for a momentary lifeline, leaving themselves with a roster of characters that no major Hollywood studio wanted to touch. By the time the dust of the sales had settled, the characters remaining in the Marvel vault were what the industry considered the bottom of the barrel. Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America were viewed as B-list heroes at best. Hollywood executives laughed at the idea of an Iron Man movie. To the average person in the 1990s, Tony Stark was an obscure character with an outdated origin story. Captain America was seen as a relic of the 1940s, a hero who was far too simple for the edgy, cynical audiences of the late 90s. These were the unfilmable rejects. Marvel was no longer a creative powerhouse. It was a desperate licensing office, fighting over the scraps of its own legacy. They were a company without their biggest stars, standing in the shadow of the giants they had been forced to sell away to their competitors. While the creative side of the company was in ruins, a literal war was being fought in the boardrooms. 2 of the most feared and aggressive corporate raiders in America, Ron Perlman and Carl Icahn, were locked in a bitter struggle for control of the corporate carcass. Perlman had originally bought the company and loaded it with massive amounts of debt, using Marvel's reputation as collateral for his own financial maneuvers. Carl Icahn, seeing an opportunity to seize a valuable brand for a bargain price, began a hostile takeover attempt that turned into a legal nightmare. This was a civil war of bank accounts and legal filings. Neither man was particularly interested in the stories or the artistic integrity of the characters. To them, Marvel was just a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet to be manipulated for profit. The internal conflict tore the company apart from the inside, distracting the staff from the changing landscape of cinema. They were sinking fast, and the captains were too busy fighting over the steering wheel to notice the iceberg. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The situation for the legendary comic book house seemed utterly hopeless. By the end of this corporate massacre, Marvel was out of cash, out of famous heroes, and out of time. They were standing on the edge of a jagged cliff, looking down into a darkness that had swallowed many legendary companies before them. The rest of the world had already written them off as a ghost of the past, a colorful memory from a bygone era of print media. How do you build an empire when you have already sold your best soldiers to your competitors? How do you convince the world to care about the heroes that everyone else has already rejected? The answer would eventually require a gamble so massive that it would either save the company or destroy it forever. But for now, the halls of Marvel remained silent, haunted by the ghosts of the heroes they no longer owned. The silence in the aftermath of the 1996 bankruptcy was not the peace of recovery, but the heavy, expectant stillness of a graveyard. However, within the walls of the company, a new generation of leaders began to stir with a vision that defied the logic of the time. Avi Arad, a man who understood the symbiotic relationship between toys and storytelling, alongside a young and ambitious producer named Kevin Feige, realized that the old model of licensing was a slow death for their creative soul. They were essentially giving away the keys to the gold mine and only receiving a few copper coins in return. They decided on a plan so audaciously risky that many in the industry called it a corporate suicide mission. They wanted Marvel to become its own independent film studio, producing its own movies with its own money, rather than just selling the rights to others. In 2005, Marvel struck a deal with the investment bank Merrill Lynch that would either solidify their legacy or erase them from history forever. They secured a massive loan of $525 million. But this was not free money, and the stakes were higher than anything the entertainment world had ever seen. To get that capital, Marvel had to put up the movie rights to its remaining characters as collateral. This included the Avengers, Captain America, and Thor. If their first few movies failed to perform at the box office, the bank would seize the rights to those characters forever. Marvel would be left as an empty shell, a brand without its heroes. It was the ultimate all-in bet. They were gambling their entire existence on a handful of films starring characters that the world at large did not yet consider to be superstars. The first character they chose to lead this revolution was Tony Stark, the man behind the Iron Man armor. At the time, this was seen as a bizarre and dangerous choice. Tony Stark was not a noble, uncomplicated hero like Superman. He was a flawed, arrogant billionaire with a history of making mistakes and a reliance on technology rather than innate superpowers. To make matters even more controversial, they chose an actor who mirrored those very traits in his own life. Robert Downey Jr. was considered unhireable by most major studios during that era due to his public struggles and his frequent run-ins with the law. But Kevin Feige saw something that no one else in Hollywood was willing to acknowledge. He saw a perfect, poetic parallel between the redemption of the man and the redemption of the brand. Robert Downey Jr. was given a final chance at relevance, just as Marvel was taking its final shot at survival. The production of the first Iron Man film was a chaotic but inspired process. The script was often unfinished, and the actors were encouraged to improvise, bringing a level of naturalism and wit to the superhero genre that had never been seen before. This wasn't just about making a movie. It was about capturing lightning in a bottle. Robert Downey Jr. carried the weight of his past like a leaden suit of armor. But when he stepped in front of the camera, he transformed that weight into a performance that was electric, charming, and deeply human. The secret weapon, however, was not just the casting or the direction. It was a strategic shift that fundamentally changed how stories were told in cinema. Kevin Feige envisioned what he called a cinematic universe, an interconnected ecosystem where every film was a chapter in a much larger book. The industry laughed at the idea, claiming it was too complicated for a general audience to follow. Traditional Hollywood wisdom suggested that audiences would be confused by interconnected plots, or that the logistical nightmare of managing dozens of actors would eventually sink the project. But Feige and his team persisted, building a foundation where characters could cross over and stories could bleed into one another, creating a sense of scale and consequence that mirrored the comic books themselves. When Iron Man hit theaters in May of 2008, the world felt a tectonic shift in the cultural landscape. The film was an instant sensation, blending humor, heart, and high-octane action in a way that felt entirely fresh. Robert Downey Jr. did not just play Tony Stark. He became the definitive face of the new Marvel. The box office numbers were staggering, but more importantly, the movie proved that Marvel could stand on its own 2 feet. They were no longer the desperate beggars of the 1990s. They were becoming the architects of a new kind of mythology. However, the success of one movie did not mean the war was won. The question on everyone's lips was whether they could repeat the miracle or if Iron Man was simply a fluke. While the world watched the box office numbers climb, one man in a different part of the industry was watching more closely than anyone else. Bob Iger, the chief executive officer of Disney, saw a hidden value in Marvel that the rest of the market had ignored. He understood that in the 21st century, intellectual property was the most valuable currency in existence. In 2009, he engineered a deal to buy Marvel for $4 billion. Critics and analysts mocked the move, calling it a desperate overpayment for a library of characters that was supposedly already past their prime. They believed Disney was buying a sinking ship. They could not have been more wrong. Bob Iger and Kevin Feige shared a vision of long-term strategic patience. They weren't looking for a quick win. They were building an empire that would last for decades. They understood that the true power of Marvel was not in any single character, but in the connective tissue that bound them all together. This was the birth of the modern blockbuster era, where the movie itself was just one part of a larger, ongoing conversation with the audience. The final piece of the initial puzzle was a small, quiet scene, hidden after the credits of the first Iron Man movie. When Nick Fury emerged from the shadows to speak about the Avengers Initiative, it was more than just a fun teaser for the fans. It was a declaration of war against the traditional Hollywood model and a promise to the world that something much bigger was coming. It was the first step toward a global domination that no one, not even the most optimistic executive at Marvel, could have fully predicted at the time. The gamble was paying off, and the house that was once in ruins was now becoming the most powerful castle in the world. But as the universe began to expand, the challenges would only grow larger and more complex. The momentum began to build, like a massive freight train that refused to slow down, gaining speed with every new release and every new character introduced to the world. By the time 2012 arrived, the entire entertainment industry was holding its breath in a state of collective skepticism. The release of The Avengers was the ultimate test of the radical concept Kevin Feige had pitched years earlier. Could 4 or 5 separate franchises, each with their own unique tones and stories, successfully merge into a single, cohesive narrative? The answer was a resounding yes that echoed across the globe. That single film earned over $1.5 billion at the box office, shattering records and proving to the world that the audience was not just watching movies anymore. They were participating in an ongoing cultural event that required their full attention. This was the official start of the domination phase, where Marvel Studios moved from being a scrappy survivor of bankruptcy to being the undisputed leader of global entertainment. This period revealed a brilliant business mechanic that analysts and business schools now refer to as the flywheel effect. Each individual film acted as a 2-hour high-budget commercial for the next movie in the sequence. If you watched Captain America, you were immediately primed and excited for the Winter Soldier. If you followed the events of the Winter Soldier, you were desperate to see the dramatic fallout in Civil War. Marvel had effectively created a loop of mandatory viewing. It was no longer enough for a casual fan to see one movie a year. To understand the full, intricate tapestry of the story, you had to see them all. This strategy did not just increase ticket sales through sheer volume, it created a powerful sense of urgency and community. The brand itself became the star, proving to be far more powerful than any individual actor or director in the long run. Perhaps the most fascinating irony of this massive success was how the initial loss of their biggest stars actually saved the company in the end. In the 1990s, selling the movie rights to Spider-Man and the X-Men felt like a devastating death blow to the company's future. But in retrospect, that forced scarcity was a hidden creative blessing. Because they did not have access to their most famous characters, the team was forced to innovate and take risks that a safer studio would have avoided. They had to find a way to make the world fall in love with a talking raccoon, a sentient tree, and a master thief who could shrink to the size of an ant. By treating these supposedly lesser characters with the same depth, heart, and respect as the global icons, they built a deeper and more diverse library of intellectual property. They proved to everyone that vision and execution matter far more than the raw, historical popularity of an asset. They took what the industry called the bottom-of-the-barrel rejects and turned them into the gold standard of modern cinema. As the years progressed through the 20-teens, the financial figures associated with the brand became almost impossible for the average person to comprehend. The culmination of this incredible decade-long journey arrived with the twin releases of Avengers: Infinity War and Avengers: Endgame. These were not just standalone films. They were the grand conclusion of a 22-movie narrative arc that had been carefully woven together over 11 years. Endgame alone brought in nearly $2.8 billion in revenue, briefly becoming the highest-grossing film of all time and sparking a worldwide phenomenon. When you step back and look at the total overarching picture, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has generated over $33 billion in global box office revenue since the release of Iron Man. This staggering figure does not even account for the billions more made in merchandising, theme parks, and digital streaming content. It is a level of financial domination that has completely redefined the meaning of the word blockbuster for the 21st century. The core of this unprecedented success lies in a business philosophy that is vanishingly rare in the volatile and often reactive world of Hollywood. That philosophy is built on consistent leadership and long-term strategic patience. While other major studios cycled through dozens of different executives and panicked at the very first sign of a lukewarm critical reception, Disney and Marvel stood firmly by Kevin Feige. This allowed for a single, unified, creative vision that spanned over a decade of production. Bob Iger's crucial decision to give Kevin Feige the autonomy and the massive resources he needed was the primary catalyst that turned a $4 billion acquisition into a $33 billion empire. They understood a fundamental truth that their competitors missed. The real value of Marvel was not found in a single comic book or a single hero. but in the invisible connective tissue that bound every single story together into a greater whole. Looking back at the cold, grey reality of that New York courtroom in 1996, the transformation of the company feels almost like a work of mythic fiction itself. Marvel rose from the literal ashes of corporate greed and short-sightedness to become a modern myth-making machine for a global audience. They transitioned from a company that was forced to sell its own soul just to pay its electric bills into a powerhouse that eventually had the capital to buy back the very pieces it once lost. The acquisition of 21st Century Fox brought the X-Men and the Fantastic Four back home, and a historic, unprecedented deal with Sony allowed Spider-Man to finally rejoin his friends on the big screen. The circle was finally complete. The story of Marvel is a powerful reminder that the market often fails to see the true value of an underlying idea until someone with a clear vision has the courage and the patience to build it from the ground up. It is a tale of corporate and creative redemption that perfectly mirrors the journeys of the characters we see on the screen. Just as Tony Stark had to lose everything and face his own mortality to find his true purpose as a hero, Marvel had to face total financial collapse to discover its true potential as a storyteller. Today, they stand at the absolute summit of the global entertainment industry, but their journey provides a stark and haunting warning to their competitors. Success is not just about having the best assets or the most famous names. It is about knowing how to weave those elements together into something that people truly care about. While Marvel was busy conquering the world and building their empire, their greatest rival was making a profound and systemic mistake that would eventually cost them over $100 billion in lost potential and brand damage. That tragic story of a different kind of collapse is one we will explore in our very next episode.